So, hello, welcome back. This is the second part of the Chapter 18 material where we add in a curve. Again, it's going to be a line that is known as the MP curve. And we'll do some very preliminary analysis with this resulting model of combining the IS and the MP curves. And then we'll save the bulk of it for after going through the material that's in chapter 19. So as I said in the previous notes, what we're going to be doing right now, of course, is going through the MP curve and putting the IS and MP relationships together. But what I prefer to do is to, rather than dwelling on this, dig into chapter 19. And then since chapter 20 is essentially just combining chapters 18 and 19, when we're in chapter 20, then practice with this kind of stuff. So we are going to talk about this MP curve, and MP is the acronym for monetary policy. So in part, what we're describing with the MP curve is in fact the conduct of monetary policy. So, excuse me. The process of setting interest rates in an effort to influence economic conditions is what we mean by monetary policy. In the United States, the monetary policy is conducted by the Federal Reserve System, and we'll see in Chapter 22 a little bit more detail about the institutional structure of the Federal Reserve System. But for now, I can note that there is a policy-making group in the Federal Reserve System that's known as the Federal Open Market Committee. So you'll see reference perhaps to FOMC. That's the Federal Open Market Committee. And the FOMC meets about 8 times a year with the objective of setting monetary policy. So we're going to, as I said, dig in a little bit more to how monetary policy is implemented when we get to the material in chapter 22. But for now, we can note that the way in which monetary policy in the US is conducted is similar to the way it's conducted in many other countries. And you'll see the nuances of this, no doubt, when you look at when you get involved in your project, in your group project. But in the US, we can note that, or more generally, we can note that when there is an interest rate on a loan that involves no risk, that interest rate is what's known as a risk-free interest rate. So in the conduct of monetary policy, what the Federal Reserve System is doing is setting a target, so a goal, in other words, that it's pretty effective in hitting. So it sets this goal for a specific interest rate in the macroeconomy that's known as the federal funds interest rate. And that sort of sounds like it's something that the Fed sets, but it's not. It's a market-driven interest rate. It's actually an interest rate, of course, determined by supply and demand for a thing that's known as bank reserves. So this is determined by commercial banks, banks is demand and supply for a thing that's known as reserves. And when we are in chapter 22, we'll explain that a little bit more. But suffice it to say that commercial banks are going to borrow and lend. Commercial banks borrow if they're a demander, of course, or lend if they're a supplier of reserves. Reserves at a price that is the federal funds interest rate. So this is just one type of financial market in the macroeconomy, short-term financial market. Commercial banks are borrowers and lenders of reserves, and this borrowing and lending is an overnight transaction. So we'll see why that happens in chapter 22, but suffice it to say that commercial banks are borrowing and lending bank reserves overnight. And because it's overnight, nothing is correctly defined, nothing is exactly risk-free, but this is essentially risk-free for all intents and purposes. So we can view the Fed as setting a target for a nominal risk-free interest rate. And then we can further note that for a given inflation rate, so again, we are just taking the rate of inflation as given now. So for a given inflation rate, if the Fed is targeting the nominal interest rate, then it is effectively targeting the real interest rate. When the Fed, so Fed is short for Federal Reserve System, so the Federal Reserve System is shortened to the Fed often. So for a given inflation rate, when the Fed targets a nominal interest rate, in this case targets a nominal value for the federal funds rate, the Fed is, for all intents and purposes, essentially targeting a real interest rate. It's essentially setting a target for a risk-free, because of the way that we define the Fed funds rate, real interest rate. And this is important because if you recall from the previous notes, when we drew the picture for the IS curve on the vertical axis, the relevant price variable was a real interest rate. So we need to somehow map a monetary policy into that same picture, and this is the framework that we have. So the Fed sets a target for a nominal Fed funds interest rate, and effectively that is the same thing as targeting a real interest rate. Now, when we think about what the overall real interest rate is in the macroeconomy, it is not only this risk-free real interest rate, but there's also a risk premium. And the risk premium is the extra interest that lenders charge to borrowers in order to reflect the fact that there is some risk involved in lending money. And so we'll see a little bit more detail on slide 8 what we mean by these different, what are the elements of the risk premium. For now, we'll just say that there is a risk premium. And in general, then, when we think about what drives the risk premium itself is going to change with changes in the conditions in financial markets. And so what I'm leading up to here and what influences this risk-free real interest rate. So the risk-free nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation, of course, is the risk-free real interest rate. So we could think of this for practical purposes here as the real federal funds rate. Right, is the nominal federal funds rate minus, so that's what all of this is. The nominal federal funds rate minus the rate of inflation we can think of as, of course, the real federal funds rate, which is, for all intents and purposes, again, a risk-free real interest rate. And so what I want to get at is this is going to define for us the MP curve, the monetary policy curve. That is, the monetary policy curve is going to be defined by the combination, in this case, the sum of whatever the real Fed funds rate is plus the underlying risk premium in the macroeconomy. And so what we ultimately want to think about as well is shifts in the MP curve. And so one thing that's going to cause shifts in the MP curve, as we'll see, is changes in the risk premium. The other thing that's going to cause shifts in the MP curve is when the Fed changes its stance for monetary policy. So as the Fed changes its target for the Fed funds rate, then that will, for a given rate of inflation, of course, change this risk-free real interest rate as well. So let's look at a picture of this. So the way in which we can think about the MP curve, and again, like the IS curve, we're drawing this in fact as totally horizontal. The MP curve is illustrating is illustrating the current real interest rate that exists in the macroeconomy, and that is shaped by the interaction of monetary policy and the risk premium that exists in the macroeconomy. So for example, suppose it is the case that the Fed adopted a target for the real Fed funds rate at 3.5%, and suppose further that there was a 0.5% that reflects risk, and so that would mean that the MP curve is drawn at this 4% level. And then, as we'll see in short order, when either the risk premium changes or the Fed's target for the risk-free real interest rate, so we should probably put in here real, since that's what we're measuring on the vertical axis, when either of those things change, then the position of the monetary policy curve is going to change, and it's either going to shift up or down and maintain this perfectly flat form. So it's horizontal because at a point in time we take the risk premium as given, and we take the Fed's target for the real value of the Fed funds rate as also given. So what we can remark upon then is that anytime there is a financial shock in the macroeconomy, then there's going to be a shift in the MP curve. So in terms of thinking about the different kinds of things that could shift the MP curve, we can recall, of course, that the MP curve is going to shift when we have changes in either monetary policy or changes in the underlying risk premium in the macroeconomy. And so for monetary policy shifts in the MP curve, what I'm going to describe are upward shifts. So in other words, if we had the output gap on the horizontal axis, of course, and we have the real interest rate on the vertical axis, if this is initially our, say as we had in the previous case, our initial MP curve, things that would cause the MP curve to shift like this in an upward direction, say from MP0 to MP1, and consistent with a level, say, of 5%, would be either changes in monetary policy or changes in the underlying riskiness in the macroeconomy, or both. So what are the kinds of things that we would be talking about then in terms of the risk premium? Basically, we're just talking about whether it is the case that borrowing and lending, well, lending on the part of a bank becomes riskier. So, what kinds of things can account for risk in the macroeconomy? Well, one of the things that can account for risk in the macroeconomy is default risk. So, default risk is, as the name suggests, the idea that the borrower isn't going to repay their debt or won't repay in a timely fashion. Liquidity risk refers to the idea that sometimes banks need cash, and the more lending they do, the harder it is, other things equal, to get that cash that's tied up in loans. So, liquidity risk is going to arise when there are disruptions in financial markets that mean that there aren't potentially any borrowers, or there aren't anyone willing to borrow at a particularly reasonable price. And so, if there aren't any borrowers from the perspective of the bank, then it means that that the bank's liquidity risk is changing. Interest rate risk refers to the problem that we kind of talked about a little bit earlier in the context of present value, and that's the idea that when there's lending that happens, the longer the term is, the greater the possibility it is that the the outcome is poor. And so this can happen because either well, say because inflation, for instance, turns out to be different from what was expected. So from the perspective of the lender as a bank, when inflation, of course, turns out to be higher than was expected, then that means that the lender, the bank, is getting a lower real return as a result of lending. And so, therefore, the longer is the duration of the loan, the more likely it is that inflation is going to turn out to be different from what was predicted, just simply because it's harder to predict the farther into the future we go. And so, there is this problem is what's known as interest rate risk. And then finally, risk aversion is the idea that um, lenders might become more reluctant to take on risk in general. So if they become more risk averse, they're only willing to make a loan if they can charge a higher risk premium overall. So changes in market sentiment can be something that will also cause the MP curve to shift. So just listening to myself, that discussion was a little rough. These different things are delineated in the textbook if you wanted to see an additional explanation on page, let's see, 472. And so, suffice it to say for us that if it is the case that there is greater default risk, greater liquidity risk, interest rate risk, or just lenders become more risk averse in general, then this is going to be something that causes them to uh, raise the risk premium, which for a given level of the Fed's targeted Fed funds rate will cause the MP curve to shift upward. Now, what we can do, and this is where things start to get fun as far as I'm concerned, is put the IS and the MP curves together. And putting them together is going to provide a story about the state of the economy. So again, the IS curve is describing how the output gap and the real interest rate are related to one another. And the MP curve essentially tells us what real interest rate will actually prevail in the macroeconomy. So we put them together to get a more complete picture. And then we'll see what happens next in chapter 19. So there are several steps to kind of putting these things together. They should be relatively straightforward at this point. So in the last set of notes, we talked about the IS curve. Of course, the IS curve is describing points of macroeconomic equilibrium. And they are, again, the ways in which aggregate expenditure and therefore the output gap change with different values of the real interest rate. So again, this output gap is the income is real GDP minus the potential level of real GDP divided by the potential level of real GDP, IAL, times 100 to express it as a percentage, right? And we noted before in the prior set of notes that when there are higher interest rates, then this is going to be something that reduces especially consumption, investment, and net exports. And we can put a question mark by G, which reduces aggregate expenditure, that reduces production, and that causes the output gap to become more negative. So in other words, if we move from here to here, initially the output gap might be minus 1%, then it's minus 5% as a result of higher interest rates. And conversely, if interest rates drop, then we would see the opposite sort of movement. Now we can add the MP curve in here because that's going to tell us the real interest rate that is determined jointly by the stance of monetary policy as well as conditions regarding especially risk in financial markets. And when we put those two things together, we can define the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, and that's going to be where these two curves intersect. And jointly then, this is going to determine for us the output gap. So when the real interest rate in this case is 4%, the equilibrium output gap is minus 5%, which means, of course, that real GDP is 5% below potential. And so what we can do with this then is play around as the MP curve shifts up or down, or as the IS curve shifts right or left, then we're going to see a new combination of interest rate and output gap. So for instance, let's think about the application of monetary policy. So the Federal Reserve, again, is going to implement monetary policy by changing its target for the Fed funds rate. And monetary policy changes are going to be associated with a shift in the MP curve. And so we're going to define expansionary monetary policy as one that is consistent with a lower targeted real interest rate, and contractionary monetary policy is the opposite. So if it is the case that we have a lower targeted real interest rate, then this is saying that the MP curve is shifting downward. So when we have more expansionary monetary policy implemented in the macroeconomy, then the MP curve is going to shift downward. And when we have more contractionary monetary policy being implemented in the macroeconomy, this means that the Fed will raise its target for the Fed funds rate in both real and nominal terms effectively. And so this will be consistent with the MP curve shifting upward. Okay. And as we will see, when the MP curve shifts, then we have a new equilibrium in the macroeconomy. So let's suppose that we start off in this framework with the macroeconomy in equilibrium at point A. We can think about this as an equilibrium that is consistent with a recession. We have, of course, output below the potential level. So Y is less than the potential level here by 5%, in fact. And we can also remark, of course, that the actual unemployment rate is bigger than the full employment unemployment rate, or that, in other words, cyclical unemployment is greater than 0. So we can start to tie together some of the things that we were doing earlier, which in my estimation makes this fun. Now, what might the Fed do if it wanted to close this output gap? And before we do that, let's just think for a minute, why? So again, remember that this equilibrium is one where the economy is going to stick. That is not a good equilibrium in the sense that what we would prefer is for the economy to be experiencing full employment. So, this is, as we talked about in the prior set of notes, a situation or an instance, an example in which we have something that is individually rational, but from society's point of view, just bad and collectively terrible, as the way the authors put it. But there is nothing as it stands right now that would move the economy from this spot because it is an equilibrium. We have all of the suppliers and demanders in the economy behaving in an optimal fashion. It just happens that the way in which their actions coordinate leave us with a situation in which the equilibrium level of gross domestic product is less than the potential level. So we have an example, one of many that we'll talk about over the course of the next week or so, week and a half or so, where we're infinitely smart and we can craft monetary policy very precisely. And in this particular case, what we would remark upon is that if the Fed were to implement expansionary monetary policy, so by cutting real interest rates, that's really a shorthand for saying the Fed lowers its target for the federal funds interest rate. And when it lowers its target for the Fed funds interest rate, we'll suppose in this instance, because we have no reason to suppose otherwise, the risk premium isn't changing. That's going to be something that then causes the MP curve to shift downward. And as the MP curve shifts downward, what we can see is that we move to a new equilibrium. And because we're so smart, we've moved to an equilibrium at which the output gap is closed. We have at this point, of course, full employment. And the only unemployment then that we see is frictional and structural in nature. So specifically, cyclical unemployment is 0. And this movement from point A to point B, oops, or point C as we have it here, eliminates the negative output gap. I'm going to go back actually to my picture. And the reason that we would call this expansionary monetary policy is that this action of reducing the target for the Fed funds rate is one that results in a higher level of real GDP or an expansion. So the adjective expansionary is going to refer to what happens to real GDP. So an expansion in real GDP, and of course in this particular case, the output gap in the language that that I'm going to try to adopt in here, that the output gap becomes more positive. And in this case, because we're moving to full employment, we could remark that the output gap is exactly 0, but it moved from negative 5% to 0. So this picture then cleans it up a little bit. So again, what we see is that the Fed could reduce its target for the Fed funds rate. That would be something that would be associated with a downward shift in the MP curve and a new equilibrium where we have a higher level of gross domestic product and the closing of the output gap. So what would be the reason for implementing monetary policy? Well, implementing monetary policies, justification in this sense is that without it, we would be stuck at an equilibrium like point A and waiting for no one knows how long. I mean, there would have to be some other kind of shock to this macroeconomy in the form of a change in the MP curve or the IS curve to move us to a different equilibrium. But specifically, the whole time that we were at point A, we have this protracted period in which output is below potential and unemployment is above the full employment unemployment rate. And we talked about the costs of having unemployment, and we would in this instance, be able to avoid those costs. We can also talk about fiscal policy by putting together some of what we talked about in the previous set of notes with this fuller specification of the model. So when the government changes fiscal policy, it's shifting the IS curve. So again, shifting the IS curve because clearly an increase in G shifts shifts the IS curve directly. And we know that if there is a decrease in taxes, then say if that's on households, this is something that would increase disposable income, which should increase consumption and would shift the IS curve rightward. And this would also shift IS rightward. Or if this tax cut were on firms, then this would be something that would increase after-tax profitability. That would be something, for the reasons that we've talked about in chapter 14, cause firms to want to undertake more gross private domestic investment, and that also shifts the IS curve rightward. So specifically in this case, when we talk about expansionary fiscal policy, this is going to happen when we have an increase in government expenditures or a decrease in taxes and a rightward shift in the IS curve. And contractionary fiscal policy be the opposite, a decrease in government expenditures or an increase in taxes and a leftward shift in the IS curve. And as we'll see, these adjectives, expansionary and contractionary, are again, just like with monetary policy, going to refer to what happens to gross domestic product and what happens to, therefore, the size of the output gap. And that's what we're going to turn to right now. So remember that we could think about this particular situation of suppose that initially we have the economy at a short run equilibrium at this point where again we have what the authors refer to as a recessionary equilibrium. We have a situation in which the output gap is negative, and again, what does that mean? That means that actual gross domestic product is less than potential, and cyclical unemployment, therefore, is greater than zero, and because the actual level of unemployment is greater than the full employment unemployment level. When the government increases government expenditures, for instance, then this is going to be something that causes the IS curve to shift. And in the previous set of notes, we saw that this shift is going to be a combination of two things. So government expenditures would go up by a certain amount, and then the circular flow tells us that there's a spending and respending process in the macroeconomy that's described by the multiplier process. And so together, the IS curve is going to shift out by more than just the change in government expenditures and by whatever the multiplier dictates. So this is going to lead to a new equilibrium in the macroeconomy, and if it's done just right, as it is in this picture, then this is going to lead to a closing of the output gap. Notice that in this particular case, The real interest rate doesn't change because there isn't anything that's affecting the position of the MP curve. So the IS curve is shifting out to the right, and we have a closing of the output gap. And again, at this point, then we have full employment in the macro economy. So what I want to turn to is the second of our participation questions, and then we'll work our way up to the ending of these notes. So we are at the conclusion of this chapter. We could do more examples, of course, and I encourage you to do that. But I think we're going to have even more fun with examples once we introduce the material that's in chapter 19. So what I want to do, rather than dwelling on examples right now and then redoing those examples, I want to introduce the material in chapter 19 and then come back and play, if you will, with the fuller model that comes from the integration of the chapter 18 and chapter 19 material. So where are we? We have talked about the IS-MP framework. We have said that we can use it to forecast economic conditions and to determine how those economic conditions can respond to monetary policy and fiscal policy. So we can trace the ups and downs of the business cycle by shifts in aggregate expenditure and then by extension in the IS curve. So as aggregate spending changes, then the IS curve shifts in exactly the same way. And you'll see some examples of this in the homework assignment that I give following these notes. And then as well, we'll do this in the course of several examples after we finish the chapter 19 material. Again, monetary policy shifts the MP curve. Fiscal policy, because it just amounts to a change in aggregate expenditures, because fiscal policy changes aggregate expenditure, then it also shifts the IS curve. And the multiplier in the context of fiscal policy is what we're talking about, is going to determine how far the IS curve is going to shift. So what's up next? We have a clicker question before we end this, or not clicker question, participation question, but then what we're going to move to in chapter 19 is to incorporate inflation. So we want to think about what causes inflation in the macroeconomy and think about how we're going to tie that into the IS and MP model. So we'll do that in two stages. First, talk about the inflation aspect, and then put these two things together. So with that, we'll turn to a clicker question and then conclude.